Have you ever thought about viewing the sun through a telescope? It's easy to get confused by the conflicting advice out there, but never fear. I'm going to explain everything you need to know and I'll make it easy to understand. I'm going to review how you can safely use a telescope for solar observing and help you decide whether it's right for you. We'll be looking at different types of solar viewing gear and helping you understand the pros and cons of each one. Please take a moment and click the subscribe and like buttons if you find these types of videos helpful. I take a lot of time creating content and I invest only my own money, so I appreciate it when you can help me with the algorithm. All right, let's get started. The sun is the only star you can see in the daytime, and it's unique among all other astronomical objects in that it looks different every day. You can see the Lagoon Nebula or the Andromeda Galaxy, and they're pretty much the same from one year to the next. But the sun is always changing, making solar observing fun and interesting. Plus, you don't need to stay up all night. Viewing the sun requires special considerations and unique filters that you don't use after dark. At the most basic level, you can safely view the sun with a homemade pinhole box camera or with approved eclipse glasses, but that's got limited utility unless there's an eclipse or a really enormous sunspot grouping. So for this discussion, I'm going to focus on how to safely use a telescope to look at the sun, so you can apply some meaningful magnification and see some of the really cool details. While the sun is an interesting and fun target to observe, it's also the most dangerous thing to observe. Viewing the sun without proper filters, even for a few seconds, could lead to permanent, irreversible blindness. So you need to ensure you are only using equipment specifically designed to safely show the sun. With the right filters, you can view the photosphere and the chromosphere of the sun. You won't see the outermost layer, the corona, unless you're viewing a total eclipse. The chromosphere can be viewed either in hydrogen alpha, which is the most common way, or in calcium K wavelength. However, calcium K observers are usually imagers because the calcium K wavelength is far into the blue end of the spectrum and difficult to see visually. Well, what can you expect to see when you look at the sun with the right equipment? The simplest solar filters to make are broadband filters. They allow you to safely view the photosphere of the sun. This view will show the sunspot core, which is the umbra, as well as the penumbra, granulation, and faculae. When the sun is active, you can follow sunspot groups as they move across the surface each day and note how they morph into different shapes. This view is also good for viewing planetary transits, although at the moment that's not very useful because the next Mercury transit is in 2032 and the next Venus transit doesn't happen until 2117. A broadband filter can show you a solar eclipse and satellite transits. Satellite transits, especially of the International Space Station, are lots of fun. A link to a Transit Finder website is provided in the notes, along with a link to a tutorial I've made on how to capture a satellite transit with a solar telescope. Most people use a normal refractor telescope. Then they add either a broadband objective filter or they replace the normal star diagonal with a Herschel wedge. Objective filters can be any size, while Herschel wedges generally work well for telescopes up to about 150 millimeters in aperture. Both types of filters significantly attenuate light getting to the eyepiece or camera, making it safe to view. Depending upon the filter used, the sun can appear white, yellow, or blue. If you're using an objective filter, ensure it is secured well to the end of the telescope. If it were to fall off while you're observing, severe eye injury or blindness could result. It's also good practice to cap off or remove any guide scopes attached to the telescope. You can observe the photosphere with a reflector or a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope if you have a full aperture off-axis broadband filter designed to match your telescope, but most people use refractors. When you see the sun on hydrogen alpha for the first time, it's an incredible experience. The sun changes every day, and can spit out solar flares and looping prominences without warning. These are invisible unless you have a hydrogen alpha telescope. To see the sun's chromosphere, you'll either have to have a dedicated HA scope or modify a normal refractor. I should point out here that you cannot use a hydrogen alpha filter that you might be using to look at the HA region of a galaxy or a nebula at night. These filters are relatively inexpensive and will not work for the sun, and they are unsafe. First of all, their bandpass is hundreds of times too wide to see hydrogen alpha detail on the sun. And secondly, they do not sufficiently attenuate the sun's light to avoid eye damage. Never use them for solar observing, or you will injure yourself and probably damage your equipment. The key element in a hydrogen alpha telescope is an etalon. An etalon consists of two parallel, extremely flat, partially reflective glass surfaces placed very close together. The area between the glass can be either air or solid, typically mica. When broadband light enters the etalon, most of it is reflected internally away and cannot escape. But when designed and tuned properly, the hydrogen alpha wavelength and its harmonics do escape. By microscopically changing the width between the plates, you can adjust the wavelength that is passed by the etalon. This tuning is adjusted either with air pressure, or by heating the mica so it thermally expands, or by tilting the etalon. Tilt-tuned etalons are typically placed over the objective of the telescope. Pressure-tuned etalons are often placed in the middle of the telescope, and mica-based etalons are found at the eyepiece end of a telescope. Pressure-tuned systems provide the highest precision and the fastest ability to tune in real time. It should be noted that these systems are sealed and not affected by atmospheric pressure. Etalons can be made down to about 0.3 angstroms, but these are so narrow that the image will be fairly dim unless you have an enormous aperture. Another way to achieve a narrower bandpass is to stack two etalons in series. More about that soon. Strictly speaking, the light escaping from an etalon is not a single wavelength, but a set of harmonics of the fundamental wavelength. It looks like the teeth of a comb. A blocking filter is often used in a diagonal to filter out the undesirable harmonics and just leave the HA line at 56.28 angstroms. They may also block UV and IR wavelengths. Blocking filters are costly and the price goes up as the size increases. You need to get a blocking filter that matches your optical train and the camera or eyepiece you intend to use. Note that if your intended use is strictly visual, you can buy a less expensive blocking filter and still get great views, although the field of view will be smaller than with a larger blocking filter. In order to see even finer detail on the surface and more contrast, you can consider adding a second etalon in series with the first, called double stacking. This has the effect of narrowing the passed wavelength from perhaps 0.6 to 1 angstroms to 0.3 to 0.5 angstroms, providing much more contrast, especially on filaments and active regions. For example, 2.7 angstrom etalons in series will produce the same effect as 1.49 angstrom etalon. The good news is some suppliers offer modular systems, so you can start with a single stack design, and then if your interest and budget allow later on, add a second etalon. Generally speaking, the larger the aperture, the more resolution and detail you will expect to see in your images. But larger apertures for solar viewing and imaging are more affected by atmospheric turbulence, elevation, humidity, and thermal currents in the tube assembly. In practice, apertures up to about 80 millimeters are generally usable in all conditions and are fairly resistant to atmospheric seeing. I got great results with my first 80 millimeter Lunt scope, but I found when I double stacked the 80 millimeter, while I did see much more contrast and I was thrilled with the result, the image was noticeably dimmer than when single stacked. This is an effect common to all double stack systems. But when I went up to a 100 millimeter aperture, I found the double stacked image much brighter and more pleasing to view. But of course, that came at a price. The other impact of aperture is as your focal length increases, it can become harder to see the entire surface at once, depending upon what eyepiece or camera sensor you're using and the focal length of your telescope. Having said that, under great seeing conditions, a large aperture system will far outperform smaller telescopes. So part of your analysis in which solar telescope to buy will include a consideration of the typical sky conditions where you plan to observe. There are several types of solar telescopes. We have broadband telescope filters that are used for viewing the photosphere. And here there are three options. One, you can get an all aperture filter over the objective made of glass or mylar. Two, you can get an off-axis filter over the objective used only with reflector designs. Or three, a Herschel wedge, which replaces the normal diagonal. Herschel wedges come in 1.25-inch and 2-inch versions for larger telescopes up to 150 millimeters. You might still find on the used market a screw-in filter for an eyepiece called Sun. Avoid these at all costs. They are unsafe. If they overheat and crack while you're using it, you could go blind. Generally speaking, mylar or film filters are optically better than glass filters, and a Herschel wedge is optically better than a film filter. Second type of telescope is a dedicated hydrogen alpha telescope. The etalon can either be in the front. This is usually a tilt design found in smaller aperture scopes like the Coronado PST or the Lunt 40mm f10 telescope. The etalon can be in the middle. This is the case with pressure-tuned etalons that Lunt is famous for. Some manufacturers make modular systems that can serve as a regular nighttime scope, a hydrogen alpha scope, and a photosphere scope. My Lunt 100MT is a good example of that kind of design. You can also use your own telescope for hydrogen alpha viewing if you add a mica-based etalon at the eyepiece end. More about that soon. So what kind of telescope is best for solar viewing? You're only looking at one wavelength, so a color-corrected apochromat is not necessary. You can get great images with a simple achromat refractor design. However, things are not quite that simple as usual. It's also important to have a very well-figured lens, good baffling, and a quality focuser. You get what you pay for. If you want to also use your scope as a good quality nighttime astrophotography scope, then an apochromat is the way to go. But if it's only planned to be used for solar, an f7 or f8 achromat is just fine. But in all cases, be sure you get a dual speed focuser or you'll be really frustrated trying to focus on the sun. You can add a front-mounted etalon to a small refractor in single or double stack mode, or you can add a mica-based etalon after the focuser to an existing normal refractor. Mica-based etalons require a telecentric light path. Thus, they either include or require in addition a 4x magnification, so your f7 scope turns into an f30 typically. This means you have a more magnified image, which is nice for seeing the details, but you will lose the ability to see the full disk. Once you get used to a tilt tune or pressure tune system, you'll be a bit impatient trying to use a mica-based system. First of all, you have to supply power, which tilt tune and pressure tune systems don't need. Second, you have to wait about 10 minutes for it to heat up enough to be on band. Then, every time you want to make an adjustment to the tuning of the etalon, you must wait another 10 minutes for it to stabilize after any change. With my Lunt telescopes, I simply make an adjustment and observe in real time as the tuning changes. I can rock it back and forth to get the optimal best contrast view in a few seconds. With my Daystar chromosphere, it can take 30 to 45 minutes to find the right tuning, and that's if you're lucky and the clouds don't appear and the seeing hasn't changed. I have found what is typically the best position for this filter, but it can vary depending upon what you want to focus on the sun that day, and it can be a lengthy process. The two major suppliers of mica-based etalon systems are Daystar and Solar Spectrum. The Daystar Quark is designed with a 4.3x telecentric and a heater, but not a cooler, while the Solar Spectrum product uses a telecentric which is purchased separately from Bader Planetarium. Solar Spectrum units usually include a heater and a cooler. Both suppliers have low and high-end versions. Mica-based etalons are usually used with telescopes of apertures up to about 100 millimeters with only a UV-IR filter added in front of the etalon. If you have a larger aperture telescope, then you'll need to add a good quality energy rejection filter over the objective so that the intensity of the sun doesn't damage your etalon. A good supplier of ERFs is Beta Planetarium. If you're interested in imaging in calcium K, then you can consider Lunt, Daystar, or Beta Planetarium, all of whom make calcium K filters. A word about Daystar. These are the least expensive mica-based etalons, and their entry-level products come in chromosphere and prominence versions. If you're only going to get one, I recommend the chromosphere version, which also shows prominence as well. However, it should be noted that the performance of Daystar quarks is inconsistent, to put it charitably. People on the Solar Online forums, as well as experts I've talked to, report you might get one that is superb and you might get one that is a dud. My advice is to ensure that you have an ironclad, money-back customer satisfaction guarantee before buying one. I bought the quark I own from someone who's tested 3 of them and said this was the best performing. Mine works very well. Visual observing. It's not easy to recommend a specific eyepiece without knowing the focal length of your system. For example, with my TeleVue 18.2 Delight eyepiece on my f7 100mm Lunt telescope, I can see a nice full-size disc just fitting in the field of view. This is about a 39x magnification. I can also use a higher power eyepiece or a Barlow or a zoom eyepiece to see more details if I want. But if I'm using my 160mm solar telescope at f30, the focal length increases to 4.8 meters. Dividing that by 18.2 gives 264 power, which is a very high magnification. Even with a low power 40mm eyepiece, I'm still over 120x, meaning I can never get the full disk into my field of view with that telescope. Focus has nothing to do with solar viewing. It's a function of the telescope. However, from my experience, having had both coarse and fine focus ability, it is significantly easier to achieve good focus on the sun when you have a dual speed focuser. When the atmosphere is turbulent, moments of good seeing are fleeting, and that's when you need to focus the telescope. Having a fine focus ability, like a feather touch focuser, makes this much easier. The difference between correct and incorrect focus can be a 20th of a turn of the fine focus. To get this resolution with only a coarse focus can be very difficult. The other factor for a focuser is the load that it might have to support. If you have a tilt tuner on the objective or an internal air pressure etalon, this is not a concern. But if you have a mica-based etalon, you will have a much longer focal length. You might have an extender, the etalon, your blocking filter, an eyepiece, a camera, and a tilter. All these things will increase the length and torque on the focuser. So you need to ensure your focuser can support all this weight without tilting. What about cameras? If you're considering imaging the sun, use a monochrome camera because you're only looking at one wavelength. Color cameras with RGB sensors only have one red sensor for every 4 total sensors. Even worse, they often include an IR filter, which blocks some of the red sensitivity. These effects combine to significantly degrade the camera's performance when looking at the sun. Important camera decision criteria include pixel size, frame rate, and cost. I did a special YouTube tutorial on how to choose a solar camera. I'll provide a link in the notes. Some other consideration and tips. Cost. Budget matters for most of us. Do you want to try to reuse your existing telescope or get something made specifically for the sun? With an existing refractor, you can get into photosphere observing for only a couple of $100. Most people start with a simple broadband filter to see the photosphere. But if you retain an interest, you're going to want to get something that handles hydrogen alpha. That starts around $750 and goes up from there. Seeing is important. Do you live in a place that often has good seeing, meaning steady air in the atmosphere, or a place that's got bad seeing with a lot of turbulence and distortion. Where will you observe? A big aperture will not be helpful if you have bad seeing. You will be able to use a small or intermediate-sized telescope much more often than a large one. Portability is another factor. Are you observing from home, or do you want something you can throw in the car and take camping or on a trip somewhere? How rugged does it need to be? Are you able to provide power in the wilderness? What's your experience level with astronomy? Are you comfortable with do-it-yourself projects, or would you prefer something you know will work right out of the box? A scope built for viewing the sun, like a Lunt, is a very reliable choice. Adding a mica-based etalon to your existing scope might work well, or you might have some challenges. Double stack systems will outperform single stack systems. Pressure and tilt tune systems are more user-friendly than mica-based etalons because they don't require heating and time. Different manufacturers have got different levels of quality control. I would be very confident in buying anything from Lunt or Solar Spectrum. I would be less confident buying from other suppliers. How do you know if there's something interesting on the sun without setting up your telescope? The Solar Dynamic Observatory takes photos of the sun from space every 10 minutes, and then they are posted on the internet. I'll add a link to the site in my notes, and then you can check up on the sun whenever you want. It may sound surprising, but it can be difficult to find the sun in a telescope. The best method is to generally point the tube at the sun and look at the shadow and minimize the size of the shadow. Now you're going to be close. Next, you should use a specialized solar finder to get the sun exactly centered. I use and recommend a Sol Searcher finder. I provided a link in the notes. For visual, at f6 to f10, plan to have one low-power eyepiece that nicely frames the sun, and perhaps a higher power eyepiece or a 2x Barlow to see more detail. You can buy a new high-quality zoom eyepiece, but I recommend avoiding the older zoom designs, which had much worse performance. What kind of mount is suitable for solar observing? Technically, you don't need a tracking mount, but it gets old having to constantly move the scope to follow the sun. Remember, the sun can be hard to find without a good solar finder, so if it drifts out of the field of view, you have to go through that whole process again. I'd recommend at a minimum a basic tracking mount. Note that the sun moves at a different speed than the stars do, so your tracking mount also has to have a solar mode. An Alt-Az mount is fine unless you plan to do long-term time-lapse videos, in which case an equatorial mount is better. What about imaging? I have other YouTube tutorials that go into this in a great deal of detail. You should consider getting a mono camera designed to look especially at the sun and keep your exposures under 10 milliseconds and adjust your gain so the histogram is at about 75% and match the pixel size of your camera to the focal ratio. I use SharpCap for capture, but Fire Capture also works well. Check out the links I'll provide in the notes for a lot more detail. So what are my overall recommendations? What should you buy? Viewing the photosphere of the sun can be done relatively affordably with a broadband filter or a Herschel wedge. If you already own a refractor of 100mm aperture or less, you can pick up an inexpensive objective filter or a Herschel wedge and immediately start looking at sunspots and related solar activity. You can get a calcium K blocking filter that will work on regular refractors up to 100 millimeters, but that's sort of a niche in solar observing. If you want to get into the fascinating details of the chromosphere, you're going to need to make the jump to a hydrogen alpha design. Excellent starter telescopes are available around $750, but you can easily pay 10 times more for a higher end system. For hydrogen alpha, I did a review of the budget-friendly Lunt F10 40mm dedicated HA scope and was pleasantly surprised at the quality of the images I saw given the modest aperture. You can find the review here on my channel, and I'll include a link in the notes. Despite the fact I appear to have a good one, I am reluctant to recommend the Daystar Quark. You can often find them on the used market, but ensure that you get an ironclad money-back guarantee from the seller so you can check out its performance before you're fully committed. You might get a great unit and be very satisfied, but you also might not and have a difficult time getting a replacement or a refund. If you want a mica-based Etalon for an existing scope, my recommendation is Solar Spectrum, but they have a very long waiting period at the moment. I tried recently and was simply unable to get one. And remember, with Solar Spectrum, you also need to add a separate telecentric, so your costs are going to be much more, but their quality is much higher and very consistent. If your budget allows, a Lunt 80 or 100 millimeter universal hydrogen alpha telescope is a terrific choice. I did a detailed review of my Lunt 100, which can be found elsewhere on the channel. These scopes can be used to safely view the sun in hydrogen alpha, the photosphere with a Herschel wedge, or simply used as a top quality nighttime telescope to look at the moon, the planets, the stars, and the galaxies. My overall comment is for HA, you'll probably have the highest likelihood of a positive experience with a Lunt product. Whatever you choose to do, I hope this tutorial has been helpful in guiding you in your decision process. Let me know about your solar journey and feel free to ask any questions you might have. Finally, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me out.